What is the mind? What is the universe? Are they one and the same? Is one an illusion created by the other? Are these questions meaningless to begin with? Why even ask them?
I really, and I mean really, wanted to be done with this inspiring philosophy guy. But one of you out there in YouTube land, and I will never forgive you for this, sent me this video and it pissed me right the fuck off. So let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. Since pretty much forever, people have wondered about the mystery of consciousness. What is the mind? Where does it come from? Why are we sentient creatures? Well, our boy Inspiring Philosophy here has some pretty whacked out ideas about where it all comes from.
Premise 1. The mind exists. No one with a mind can doubt this. Whether you think the mind is an emergent property of the brain or a fundamental substance, you cannot doubt that your mind exists.
Okay, let's be fair. Yes, I'll grant that. It certainly seems as though the mind exists.
Premise 2. The properties of the mind are not that which matter can have.
And here is where it starts to really go off the rails.
This can be seen with the difference between mental properties and physical properties. Consider two things: feeling pain and an electrical signal to the brain. Are they the same thing?
Well, yeah. All mental properties are the product of physical properties. Our consciousness is, as you said before, an emergent property of the brain.
Of course not, because an electrical signal to the brain can happen without the feeling of pain.
This is true, but do you know the only two ways in which this happens? First and most obvious, when the sensation being felt isn't pain. But second, there's a condition called congenital analgesia, where thanks to mutations in the brain or an increased production of endorphins, people are actually unable to experience the sensation of pain. In other words, the brain and the sensation of pain are inextricably linked.
What we experience is a correlation between an electrical signal and the mental feeling of pain, but one can see the coherence of a possible world where one experiences pain without the need for an electrical signal.
Oh sure, I can conceive of such an idea. That premise has been the basis for some of my favorite science fiction and fantasy, and your own example is a ghost world. But do we have any evidence of such a phenomenon outside of fiction? No. The only evidence we have of the experience of pain comes from those nerves, those electrical pulses, our own brains. So, which is the more reasonable conclusion? That mind is a product of physical matter, or that your ghost world exists?
The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel says, if a mental event is really a physical event in this sense, and nothing else, then the physical event by itself, once its physical properties are understood, should likewise be sufficient for the taste of sugar, the feeling of pain, or whatever it is supposed to be identical with. But it doesn't seem to be. It seems conceivable for any physical event, there should be a physical event without any experience at all. Experience of taste seems to be something extra, contingently related to the brain states, something produced rather than constituted by the brain state. So it cannot be identical to the brain state in the way that water is identical to H2O.
This is a favorite tactic of Inspiring Philosophy to say, hey look, here's an atheist saying something with which I agree, therefore the rest of you atheists have to be wrong. I also love how his go-to guy is a philosopher and not, say, a neurologist, someone who actually studies the brain. You'd think that would make sense. It's also not difficult to see how the experience of pain could be a necessary step in evolution, in natural selection. Pain is the body's way of telling us, hey, that's a bad thing, stop letting that happen. And the creature that does not heed that warning or does not receive it is most likely dead. And it's the same with feelings of pleasure, too. Don't you think that without the orgasm, creatures would fuck less and therefore have fewer offspring? In fact, the only evidence we have for why someone might not be able to have these experiences is when their nervous system is messed up, when their head meats aren't working properly. So really, which is the more reasonable conclusion? That over time, through natural selection, the brain developed the ability to have these experiences as a survival mechanism, or that there's some sort of disembodied ghost spirit attached to us that translates physical sensations into experiences?
The point is that things like qualia are not physical substances. What we experience is mental substances like qualia and then we assume they come from physical substances in and of themselves. But a mental substance, like the taste of sugar, does not exist with the physical substance.
Oh, really? Then why is it that only that particular substance interacting with our nervous system is the only thing that will produce that particular qualia? Certainly sounds as though the physical substance has a lot to do with it.
They are nothing more than the mental experience and all we really know. And then we just assume they correlate to physical properties.
We don't assume any such thing. Through electroencephalography, or EEG, we can actually measure how physical substances will affect us. As most of you know, I've got epilepsy. Hey look, it's my medic alert bracelet. And last year I had to have an EEG in the hospital for 3 days, my head covered in wires, my hair a complete mess, as they tested how various stimuli would affect my mental state. And yet, despite our ability to measure these things, coupled with the fact that neurological changes and/or damage will cause these subjective experiences to be different, you still want us to suspect that mind and matter are not inextricably linked? Is that really the most reasonable conclusion given the evidence?
Therefore, upon examination, mental properties and physical properties are conceptually detached. No amount of introspection can ever reduce to the chemistry of the brain.
At this point, inspiring philosophy's position just seems laughable.
There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head.
And it's things like this that have made me lose all respect for Sam Harris, why he's my least favorite of the Four Horsemen. I mean, listen to what he says here.
There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head.
How is that not an argument from incredulity? Isn't he basically saying, I can't feel the neurons firing, I have no real sensation that they're there, therefore my subjective experience must come from another source? You might as well argue that because I can't experience your subjective consciousness, it doesn't exist and I'm the only true thinking being in the universe. Now, while I suppose that might be a possibility we have to consider technically, is that really the most likely conclusion given the evidence?
But since we know that the mental experience is not a necessary property of a physical substance, then they cannot be the same thing.
It certainly is true that the mental experience of something is not a necessary property of that physical object. For example, unaided, the human eye cannot see ultraviolet light. However, that does not mean that the mental experience and the physical substance cannot be the same thing. It just means that there are some exceptions.
Thus, our first conclusion is, mind is not reducible to matter. Premise 3.
Which, as I hope you can see now, is completely ludicrous. And given that the rest of his argument proceeds from this blatantly false conclusion, I almost don't want to go on. But let's push ahead until, frankly, I just can't stomach any more of this bullshit.
Substance dualism is false. According to substance dualism, there are two fundamental kinds of substances, matter and mind.
Except that mind isn't a substance. Mind is what the brain does. The mind is a product of brain activity.
However, this view quickly leads to problems regarding the interaction of matter and mind. The internal contradictions of interactionism demonstrate that two fundamental types of substances cannot interact. If they did, they would interact via a shared property. However, if they share a property, then they are not separate substances at all.
Right. The mind is just the rather impressive combined processing power of the brain's electrochemical activity. They're not separate things at all.
Though obvious to many, these three premises lead us to a conclusion that many find unacceptable. However, with a simple deduction, the conclusion is inescapable. If the mind exists and cannot be reduced to matter, and if substance dualism is false, then no other substance exists. Thus we conclude, all is mind, the universe is a mental construct.
Are you fucking kidding me?
What about property dualism? Could one just use premise 1 and premise 2 to arrive at property dualism? That the mental world is just a property of physical substances, and therefore doesn't reduce to its own substance, but is just a separate property emergent from matter. However, this is not parsimonious or verifiable.
Well, come on, science never actually proves anything. I mean, given the evidence, we can come to a reasonable conclusion, but there is always that chance that we've been deluded or that we're missing a certain important piece of data. But just because you cannot verify it 100% beyond any shadow of a doubt doesn't mean that it's not the most reasonable conclusion, especially given that the alternative is that the universe is a thinking being unto itself.
Since we only interact through qualia on a mental level. If there is mental and physical properties of one substance, it is not parsimonious to posit separate properties that we do not interact with just to save an independent physical reality.
The problem here is that this chart starts from an incorrect premise. The assumption is that the mental and physical are separate, and we're expected to argue starting from that particular straw man. But as I pointed out, the mind is a product of the brain. It's what the brain does. How do we observe the physical if it is not mental? By using the physical structures of our eyes, our sense of touch, taste, smell, etc. Those sensations are processed by the brain, which then reacts to those stimuli. We are, in effect, biological computers. And I'm not prepared to argue from the starting point that has been assigned to me. I think part of the problem is just how unflattering some people find this, as if that can't just be all, that there has to be more to me than just flesh and bone. It certainly feels as if there's more. It's another argument from incredulity, and more than a little confirmation bias once other possibilities are looked into.
However, more importantly, is that the mind cannot reduce to just a property. This can be shown in a simple deduction. Premise 1. If solipsism is conceivable, then a possible world could exist such that only the mind exists. Solipsism is of course the view that only your mind exists and everything else is an illusion of it.
No. Solipsism is the notion that one's mind is the only thing that can be known for certain to exist. Granted, it's easy to see how the notion that the universe might be an illusion or a delusion could come from solipsism, but it's not a necessary part of it, because anything that cannot be known for certain to exist may still do so. One just lacks enough evidence to say so for certain, unlike the mind.
Premise 2. Solipsism is conceivable. Therefore, a possible world exists with only a mind in it. Premise 3. Possible worlds cannot only consist of properties or processes, but must also include entities.
Bullshit. The notion of a universe that has no life and no entities is pretty easy to imagine.
Premise 4. There is no difference between the mind existing in a solipsist world and the actual world.
Well, that depends very specifically on what you're talking about, because it's true that the subjective, personal experiences of those worlds would be no different, but the objective, mind-external sources of those experiences would be.
This stems from Leibniz's law indiscernibility of identicals. If there are any two things, and if they are identical to each other, then for what is true of one will be true of the other. Therefore, the conclusion is, thus the mind cannot be a property or a process, and therefore physical property dualism doesn't escape the argument.
I can't help feeling like there was a step left out somewhere, or that it was assumed we're already on board with a premise that was never explicitly stated, because this makes no sense at all. I mean, it starts with the notion that if there are any two things and they are identical to each other, that what must be true for one must be true for the other, but no two brains are identical. And if the mind is an emergent property of the brain, then no two minds are going to be identical. So, unless there was a step that was just left out, this does not apply to this argument.
Now, some would be scared by this argument because they would assume it leads to solipsism. But as we said in our last video, Richard Kahn Henry and Stephen Palmquist point out, a theistic view of our existence becomes the only rational alternative to solipsism. One doesn't need to jump to the extreme idealist view that only your mind exists, but simply hold to the view that the mental world creates the construct of the physical world.
Which doesn't exactly lead us to theism. Given the available data, at most it could lead us to pantheism.
Many philosophers have also noted that we are not in control of the way the universe behaves, and therefore it is not reasonable to assume that it is just a creation of only your mind.
Except how much control do you really have over your own mind? You ever get an earworm, one of those songs stuck in your head that just won't be evicted out of your head meets? Well, what if this universe is a world worm? Hey, if you want to come up with some really stupid notions, so can I. The only difference is I know I'm kidding.
But if all is mind, then we have to deduce that it is dependent on a much larger mind.
But why? Why do we have to deduce that? I mean, let's suppose for a moment that I've accepted your premise that all is mind. There are definitely possibilities besides an all-powerful, all-knowing deity. It could be that the universe is a gestalt, a composite of every mind found within. Perhaps individual minds formed later, but it starts out as this one big, huge overmind. Perhaps not a conscious one, but still. Think of it, gosh, like the Force from Star Wars sounds like what I'm describing, which I realize is a silly notion, but frankly, it sounds a lot more likely than your God.
Which is why theism is the only rational alternative to solipsism.
Said Captain Confirmation Bias.
In fact, we cannot even conceive of a mind-independent reality without a mind.
Don't you think it's just a little bit arrogant to say that the existence of the universe is dependent upon your ability to conceive of it? If every sensing creature in the universe were just wiped out tomorrow, I'm fairly certain that its mind-external existence would continue on unperturbed.
But what about those who still reject these philosophical implications? Well, as Ian Squires said, it is probably fair to say that most members of the physics community would reject these ideas. However, the reasons would be based more on prejudice than on sound argument.
Gotta say, it sure seems the other way around. You've twisted definitions and distorted arguments until they fit your preconceived notion that a God exists. On the other hand, I've tried to look at the evidence a little more objectively, and it just doesn't match the conclusions you've reached. Anyway, until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think.
You